Hey there, Heather, ho there, it's Jeff Cutter Diamond. Welcome you to another Stone Cold Hockey thing. And we did the 65 one last video. Now we're doing 1968. See the 12 teams involved. They're unseeded, meaning that Boston's not the overall number one seed. So there are 4 preliminary round matches you see there, and 8 teams. Because there's 12 teams, there's a tournament format. 4 teams have buys into the quarterfinals. Well, if I'm looking correctly, every original 16 minus Montreal is forced to play in the preliminary round. So Montreal is in, let's see, Montreal, Oakland, Philly, and I guess Minnesota. So Minnesota, Montreal, Oakland, and Philly are all in the quarterfinals. Anyway, the preliminary round sees the New York Rangers take on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Well, this is the 1967-68 squads. Pittsburgh takes on Chicago, Detroit takes on Boston, and St. Louis takes on Los Angeles. Now, it was all random, so first game for the Rangers Leafs ends up being a Rangers 1-0 win as Jackman beats Bruce Campbell. As the Leafs didn't put Bauer in, but the Leafs scored Mike Walton from Norman and Bob Pulvert. But the Rangers goes with Roger Bear, Harry Howell, Roger Bear, and Philly Goyette. Pittsburgh, Chicago in Pittsburgh. In overtime, Dave Dryden beats Les Binkley. Chicago scored first on a goal by Orban from Makita, and then Leo Boivin for Pittsburgh, former Bruin, from Ingefeld and Rivard. But then Pitt Martin in overtime from Pierre Pilote. Yeah, that's who the Blackhawks wanted from Boston, was Pitt Martin, and it worked. Meanwhile, Detroit beat Boston 5-4 as Crozier beats Gary Cheevers. Detroit goes by Jimmy Peters, Gary Bergman, Kent Douglas, Bergman again, and then Bruce McGregor. Boston goes by Jim McKenzie, Johnny Busick, Phil Esposito, and Johnny Busick. So, yeah, Esposito's on that team. 5-4. And finally, LA beats St. Louis 2-1 as Terry Sawchuk, being King, beats Seth Martin. Jimmy Roberts scored for St. Louis from Sauber and Keaton. Jack Keaton, that is. Hughes scored for LA from Rail Lemieux and Eddie Joyal. And then Bill Cowboy Flat with 7 seconds left from Brian Kilroy, great junior coach, and Rail Lemieux. Game 2 of Pittsburgh-Chicago. See, Chicago wins 6-4 to take a 2-0 lead. Stanley DeShorty beats Hank Basson. Pittsburgh goes by Earl Ingefeld, Andy Bathgate. Yeah, he played for the Penguins. Paul Andrea and Bill Dea. Chicago goes by Doug Moens, Bobby Hall, Chico Mackey as Eric Nestorenko, Pitt Martin, and then Pitt Martin again. So yeah, maybe getting Pitt Martin was a good move. Game 2 of LA St. Louis sees St. Louis win to split the series. First 2 games, Glenn Hall beats Wayne Rutledge. LA goes by Lowell McDonald, Eddie Joyal, and Rail Lemieux. Blue goes by Barclay Plager, or it could be Bob Plager, I don't know. Because Bill McCurry, not that Bill McCurry, the referee. Red Berenson, Frank St. Marcel, Jimmy Roberts, and then McCurry again. Game 2 of Detroit-Boston saw Detroit win 4-3 as Crozier beats Gill. Who the hell is this Gill guy? Detroit goes by Pete Stamkowski, former relief. Dickie Roberts, I guess. And then 2 goes by Gordie Howe. Boston goes by Jim McKenzie, Fred Stanfield, and Bobby Orr. The man, Bobby Orr. And then Rangers Leafs. Leafs win 5-2 in New York as Gamble beats Jackman. Ranger goes by Bob Nevin and Rod Gilbert. Leaf goes by Bob Pulfer, Dave Keon, Mike Walton, Jim Pappin, and Jim Pappin again. Game 3 of St. Louis, LA. LA overtime winners. Sawchuk beat Hall, the battle of the great goalies from the 60s. LA scored with Bill White and Rail Lemieux. Gary Sabaton and Cam Cameron for St. Louis in regulation. In overtime at 12:54, Eddie Joyal from Rail Lemieux and Bill White. And the Kings now have a 2-1 series lead. Detroit beat Boston 5-0. Looks like they're going for the sweep. Gardner, the shutout against Eddie Johnston. Dean Prentice, Gary Bergman again. Greg Jarrett, I guess that is. And Dean Prentice. So Prentice with 2 goals, Bergman with 2 goals. The Red Wings looking good. Gary Bergman did play for the 72 Canada team. Leafs beat the Rangers 4-2 on home turf as Gamble beat Jackman again. Ranger goals by Rod Gilbert and Reg Fleming. Leaf goals by David Keelan, Marcel Protoville, Brian Conacher, and Alan Stanley. And then Game 3, Chicago beat Pittsburgh 2-1. They now have a 3-0 lead. Danny Girardi beats Basson. Chicago scored first. Doug Moens his second from Stan Mikita. Pittsburgh scored Keith McCreary from Rivard and Ingerfeld. And then Chicago, Bobby Hall from Reed and Mackey. Detroit-Boston Game 4 sees Boston avoid elimination. Cheevers beats Gary Edwards. Boston goes by Glenn Saver. Yeah, that. Glenn Saver. Giant Busick and Giant Busick again. Detroit goes by Gordie Howe and Bruce McGregor. Rangers-Leafs Game 4 sees the Leafs win in overtime to go up 3-2. Gamble beat Vermeer, so they went with him. Rangers, Jim Nielsen and Camille the Eel Henry with goals in regulation. Jim Pappen and Davey Keelan for Toronto. And then in overtime at 6:29, Mike Walton is third from Ron Ellis and Marcel Protoville. And the Leafs are looking good. They're up 3-1. Pittsburgh beats Chicago to avoid elimination. Les Binkley beats Jack Norris. Yeah, Jack Norris went from Boston to Chicago, I remember. Pittsburgh goes by Andy Bathgate. Andy Bathgate again. Gene Ubercole, Keith McCreary, and then Adam McDonald. Chicago goes by Bobby Hall, Kennedy Warham, and Denny Hall. And finally, LA beats St. Louis 4-1. They have a 3-1 series lead as Rutledge beats Glenn Hall. LA goes by Henry Menard, Ted Irvin. Break the walls, yeah! Chris Jericho's father. Irvin again. And then Rayon Lemieux. Her call for St. Louis scored. Game 5. Will the Leafs win the series? The answer is yes, they will. 3-1. As Gamble beats Jackman. Toronto goes by Murray Oliver, scoring twice for the Leafs, former Bruin. And then Bob Pulford, his second. Rangers, Phil Goyette scored. But yeah, the Rangers got to feel bad. I know a shut-up cutter's coming my way. Chicago, did they? Yes, they did. They went in overtime. Girardi beats Basson. Pittsburgh scored first. Uberco from Andy Bathgate. Then Chicago in the third period. Makita from Warham and Denny Hall. And then in overtime at 9:04, Makita from Pierre Pilote and Dale Jarrett in Chicago sends Pittsburgh off. Does LA beat St. Louis? The answer is no. St. Louis wins on home turf. Hall beats Suchek. Close game. Menard scored for LA from Gray. Bill McCreary scored his third for St. Louis. And then third period, Jimmy Roberts his third. And Terry Crisp, decent coach of the 89 Flames with the overtime with the empty netter. Does Detroit beat Boston? The answer is no. Boston wins 7-4 as Eddie Johnston beats Gary Edwards and Boston survives. Boston had a 3-2 lead after 2 periods. Bill Esposito, Derek Sanderson, and then Esposito scored. Detroit goes by Kent Douglas and Gordie Howe for the third period. Well, Ted Green scored, and then Gordie Howe and Frank Mahovlich. Yeah, you played better after leaving the Leafs. Well, because of all the constant headaches of one punch and black. But Boston scored 3 goals late. Phil Esposito, Eddie Shack, and Fred Stanfield were the ones who give Boston life. Anyway, St. Louis LA Game 6 saw LA win 3-1 on home turf. Rutledge beats Hall. Brian Smith? Well, Ted Irvin break the walls and Doug Robinson scoring for the Kings. Wayne Rivers for the Blues and the Kings move on. And finally, we got a Game 7. Boston beat Detroit to force Game 7. Cheevers beats Everts. Wow, this would be amazing. Detroit goes by Alex Ovechkin and Dean Prentice. Boston goes by Johnny Busick, Tommy Williams, the American, Eddie Shack, Johnny Busick, Eddie Shack again, and then Ken Hodge Sr. Game 7 sees Boston do the impossible and come back from 3-0 down. They win 4-1 as Johnston beats Edwards. Eddie Westfall, Johnny Busick, Bobby Orr, and Dallas Smith scoring, with Gordie Howe his 6th for the Red Wings. Can you believe it? The Red Wings were up 3-0 on Boston, and they fucked it up. Unreal. I gotta feel so bad for them. Too bad they don't give, like, the schedule and all that. But, man, unbelievable how Boston, Andre Gill was the guy. What surprise? Detroit. Well, Roy Everts, sorry. I said Gary Everts. Roy Everts, 0-4. So they decided to go with Roy Williams instead of George Gardner or even Roger Crozier. They go with Everts, and he shit the bed. I think Crozier got injured or something. But, yeah, I think they wanted to go for the shutout. Man, that is just pure pathetic. Regardless, quarterfinals. Yeah, they set up the preliminary round, guys. Chicago will face LA, and Boston will face Toronto. And the 4 teams with the wild card, well, Montreal will face Philly. Oakland will face Minnesota. All right, so game 1 of Chicago LA sees the Blackhawks win in overtime. Detroit beats Rutledge. LA goes in regulation by Bill Flett, Lowell McDonald, and Bill Flett again. Bobby Hall scored twice in regulation. Ken Warren scored. And then on the power play, after 2 King penalties by Hughes and Amadeo, Chico Mackey scored from Bobby Hall and Ken Warren, and the Blackhawks win the game 4-3. Montreal-Philly, first game for them. And Montreal crushes Philly 7-1 as Doug Favell lost to the Gumper. Leon Rochefort scored for Philly from Forbes Kennedy and Britt Selby. But Montreal scored 7. John Ferguson, Yvan Cournoyer, John Beliveau, Cournoyer again, Terry Harper, Ralph Backstrom, and John Beliveau. A lot of the 65 squad. Yeah, Detroit couldn't repeat, in a sense. Oakland, Minnesota, game 1. Minnesota wins on a shutout by Cesar Menego. Parker McDonald, playing for Minnesota, scored from McMahon. You're fired. And then Bo Horvat. Oh, Bronco Horvat. Not Bo Horvat. What am I thinking? For Wayne Connolly and Bill Goldsworthy. Waterloo. 2-0 Minnesota. And in game 1 of Boston, Toronto, the Bruins win 6-4. Johnston beats Gamble. Man, Boston's on fire. They were down 3-0 Detroit. Now they won 5 in a row. Toronto goes by Murray Oliver from Bruin. Wayne Carleton, Ron Ellis, and George Armstrong. Boston goes by Glenn Saver. Yeah, that guy. Eddie Shack, Ken Hodge Sr., Eddie Shack again, Derek Sanderson, and Derek Sanderson with the empty netter. Game 2 of Montreal-Philly sees the Habs win 4-1 again. Worsley beats Favell again. Louis Gotti, the only Philly goal. Montreal 4 goals. Ted Harris, Ralph Backstrom, Yvan Cournoyer, and Jacques Lemaire. Oakland, Minnesota, game 2 sees Minnesota win 4-1. As Bauman was in net against Charlie Hodge. Oakland did go by Jerry Eamon from Andre Erickson and Billy Harris. Minnesota goes Parker McDonald, scored twice in the first period. Andre Boudria and Wayne Connolly from Minnesota. I don't think that Masterton is on the team, right? No, he technically isn't. I guess he's technically still in. Alright, well, anyway. Boston-Toronto game 2 sees the Leafs win 6-2. Johnny Bauer finally gets into a game, and he beats Jerry Cheevers. Boston goes by Tommy Williams and Johnny McKenzie. Toronto goes by Ron Ellis, George Armstrong, Larry Hillman, Mike Walton, and Ron Ellis with the hat-trick. Yeah, Murray Walton from the Bruin. And finally, the Hawks win 4-2. Detroit beats Rutledge. Chicago goes by Kenny Warren, Wayne Mackey, not Chico Mackey, Bobby Hall, and Ken Warren, well, the second, Ted Gray, and Bill Cowboy Flatt for the Kings. Game 3 of Oakland, Minnesota sees Minnesota win 5-2. They're looking good. Manigo beating Hodge. Randy Collins, Andre Boudria, J.P. Parise, Milan Marcetta, and Brad Wojtowicz. Scoring from Minnesota. Oakland goes by Ron Harris and Teddy Hampson. Boston-Toronto game 3 sees Boston win 4-2 in Toronto as Cheevers gets revenge on Bauer. Toronto goes by Ron Ellis and Jim Pepin. Boston goes by Phil Esposito, Johnny Busick, Espo his second of the night, and Derek Sanderson. LA wins in overtime on Chicago. Rutledge beats Detroit. Chicago had a goal. Ken Warren, his fifth from Dennis Hall. And then Eddie Joyle from Irvin and Gray in the second. Overtime at 17:20. Saw a power play after Gilles Marat for tripping. Ted Gray, his second goal from Lowell McDonald and Eddie Joyle. And the final game 3 sees Montreal beat Philly 5-3 as Worsley beats Bernie Perron. Yeah, he was a Philly goalie before he went to the WHA. And it's a prospect he picked up from Boston. The Flyers picked up from Boston. Philly goes by Leon Rochefort, Andre Lacroix, and Leon Rochefort. Dick Duff, J.C. Tremblay, Rob Backstrom, Mickey Redmond, remember him, and Terry Harper from Montreal. Game 4, will Boston take a 3-1 series lead? They do. Boston, Cheevers beats Gamble. Boston looking good. They were down 3-0 to the Red Wings. Now they're up 3-1 in their series. Toronto goes by Bob Polford, Dave Keon, and Mike Shaker Walton. Boston goes by Phil Esposito, Eddie Shack, Johnny Busick, and Ken Hodge Sr. Chicago LA Game 4 saw the Kings win again on home turf. Sawchuck beats Shorty. Chicago goes by Pitt Martin and Bobby Hall. But Henry Menard, Laboise, and Ted Irvin break the walls. Scoring the goals. Montreal Philly Game 4 sees Montreal sweep Philly thanks to a shutout by Gump Worsley on Bernie Parent. Provo, Duff, and Cournoyer are your goal scorers, and Montreal in the first series of the year. They sweep Oakland, Minnesota. Will also be a sweep. Minnesota wins 4-1. Manigo beats Hodge. So the two teams, so Montreal and Minnesota had buys into the second round, and they have no ring rest. They sweep. Oakland goal by Sawbrick from Cahan, Larry Cahan. Minnesota goes by Andre Boudria, Bill Goldsworthy, McMahon, you're fired, and Wayne Connolly. So we see two of them. Now, LA Chicago Game 5. Chicago wins on home turf. DeShorty beats Rutledge. Chicago goes by Stan Mikita, Doug Moans, Turnberg, and Kenny Warham. LA goes by Billy Inglis and Henry Menard. Boston Toronto will end. Toronto can't believe they're left. They lose 3-1. Johnston beats Bauer. The only Leaf goal was by Bob Holford, his fourth from George Armstrong. Boston goes Johnny Busick with 2 and John Pye McKenzie with 1. So Busick looking pretty impressive. And Boston doesn't blow the lead. Chicago Game 6 will win 3-2. Mr. Shorty beats Sawchuck, and Chicago wins on the road. LA goes by Bill Cowboy Flood and Will McDonald. Wayne Mackey, Bobby Hall, and Bobby Hall again, scoring 3-2 Chicago. So on to the semifinals, where it will be Chicago, Montreal, and Minnesota, Boston. So they sweep it up. Montreal and Minnesota had buys, but now they'll face them. So Chicago will face Montreal. Minnesota will now have to take on Boston. Boston looking pretty impressive. They were down 3-0 to Detroit. They were up 3-1 in Toronto, but did the job. Minnesota with a sweep on Oakland. Montreal swept Philly. Chicago had a tough time with Los Angeles. But anyway, Game 1 sees Montreal win. Worsley beats Shorty in overtime. Chicago goes in regulation by Wayne Mackey, Bobby Hall, and Doug Moans. Montreal had Jacques Lemaire, Shills Tremblay, and Jacques Lemaire again. But at 7:48 on the power play because Marat stupidly took an interference call. Dick Duff is third of the playoffs from Brian Watson and Bobby Russo. Although it's not fair because Montreal has played fewer games. Excuse me. Minnesota Boston Game 1 saw Minnesota win 3-2 as Manigo beats Cheevers. Minnesota's got 5 in a row. Well, Montreal's got 5 in a row. Boston goals by Ken Hodge Sr. and Derek Sanderson. Wayne Connolly, Bob McCord, and Wayne Connolly again scoring for the North Stars. So Connolly with 2 goals, former Bruin. Game 2 saw Boston get back at it, winning 5-2. Cheevers beats Manigo. Minnesota goes by Roy Wooditch and Dave Bowlen, former Ranger, I guess. Bruins, Ken Hodge, Bobby Orr, Johnny Busick, Derek Sanderson, and Kenny Hodge Sr. Chicago Montreal Game 2 sees Montreal win again. Worsley beats Dryden, but not that Dryden, it's Dave Dryden. Montreal got off to a fast start, while Claude Plurville, Dick Duff, and John Bellyville scored in the first period. Dick Duff put up his 5th as the game winner. Chicago, Bobby Hall, Stan Mikita, and Kenny Warren scoring. Game 3 sees Montreal win on home turf 3-2 as Rogie Vachon gets the start and wins against Denny DeShorty. Montreal started out 3-0. Ted Harris, Bobby Russo, and Jacques Lemaire with the goals. Chicago goals by Danny Hall and Pat Stapleton. Minnesota-Boston Game 3 saw Minnesota win in overtime. Manigo beats Andre Gill. Fast first period. Boston goals by John McKenzie and Tommy Williams. Minnesota goes by Bill Collins and Mike McMahon. You're fired. Overtime heroics by Bill Goldsworthy at 3:24. Ted Green was in the box for charging. 5-minute penalty from charging. From Andre Boudreau's Parker McDonald. Game 4, Minnesota Boston. Boston with a shutout, 4-0. Andre Gill with a shutout. They go with him. Johnny Busick, Fred Stanfield, Tommy Williams, and then Busick again. Man, Busick's on fire with the goal scoring. 14. Well, they played a lot of games. Game 4 for Montreal. They win 4-1. As Worsley beats Norris. Jack Norris. Chicago. Stapleton did score from Pierre Pilat, but Montreal goals. Bobby Rousseau, Yvonne Cornway, Carol Fadney scoring, and Gilles Tremblay. So Montreal beat Chicago. They have had 2 sweeps. Minnesota Boston, game 5. Boston had to win in overtime in Minnesota. Cheevers beats Manigo. Minnesota goes in regulation by Dave Ballin, and Bill Collins. Boston goes by Eddie Shack, Derek Sanderson, and Eddie Shack again. But in overtime, 106. Ted Green, defenseman from Wayne Cashman and Bobby Orr. So Boston wins game 5 and game 6. Is in overtime, heroics by Boston. Cheevers beats Manigo. Derek Sanderson scored from Ted Green. Minnesota 2 goals. Wayne Connolly from McMahon. You're fired. And Parker McDonald from McMahon. Glenn Savers scored his 3rd of the postseason from Espo and John McKenzie. And in overtime at 17:29, Minnesota had a pair of penalties, but they didn't. Boston couldn't capitalize. John McKenzie from Bobby Orr and Ted Green. So Boston is in the final. So we have a final. Boston versus Montreal. Who lost? Chicago and Minnesota. I am going to give Minnesota the advantage for 3rd place. So Minnesota will be officially 3rd in 68. Well, they did go to 6 games where Chicago got swept. But still. So Montreal gets a 2nd team in that thing. Hopefully this time they win against the 68 Bruins. Well, Bruins. Cheevers 7-3 in net. Johnston 4-1. Andre Gill has played 3 times. And he did get a shutout, so that's not bad. Cheevers and Johnston. Cheevers is basically the main guy. Preliminary round, Boston took care of Detroit, but they were down 3-0. Boston then took care of Toronto in 5 and Minnesota in 6. Espo's got 23 points. Johnny Busick has 20. Fred Stanfield 16. Skip Craig and Gary Doak have a point each. Names you don't know. Westfall and Dallas Smith are the only guys with 1 goal. 14 by Busick. And Montreal had it in. Worsley 7-0. Fashons has only played 1 game, giving up 2 goals. They've swept Philly. They swept Chicago. So Boston had to go through the preliminary round. Montreal went through the easy way. They got the bye. The random bye. Cordway and Jacques Lemaire both have 9 points. Yeah, it's hard to say. Ferguson, Redmond, Tremblay, Fadney. Yeah, it's hard to say about Montreal because they're more rested. Anyway, the playoffs, here we go. Boston, Montreal. Game 1. Saw Austin win 4-2. Andre Gill in net against Gump Worsley. Montreal finally losing a game. Dick Duff and Gilles Tremblay scored, but Boston got goals by John McKenzie, Tommy Williams, Eddie Shack, and Gary Doak getting his first goal of the postseason. Game 2 sees Boston win 6-2. Cheevers back in net against Gump Worsley, so Montreal's getting in trouble. Boston goes by Fred Stanfield, Phil Esposito again, Derek Sanderson, Stanfield his 2nd of the night, and Johnny Busick his 15th overall. Montreal goes by Jacques Lemaire and Al Backstrom. Game 3 in Montreal. And Montreal wins on home turf. Rogie Vachon beats Eddie Johnston. And Montreal was 3-0 first period lead. Yvonne Cornway, John Ferguson, and Henri Richard finally coming up with a goal. Although Ferguson would score Boston leveled it. Esposito, Busick, and Stanfield. John Ferguson Sr. scored 4-3. Game 4, Montreal wins 3-1. Worsley beats Cheevers. Only Boston goal by Eddie Shack, his 10th. Well, Backstrom, Terry Harper, and Jacques Lemaire scoring for the Habitants. 2-2. Game 5 sees Boston win on home turf 8-2. Cheevers crushed Worsley, who stayed the whole game. Montreal, John Ferguson and Jacques Laperriere scoring. Boston goals, Glenn Saver, yeah, him, Tommy Williams, Eddie Shack, Phil Esposito, Eddie Shack, John McKenzie, Ken Hodge, and McKenzie again. So Boston putting up the pucks into the net on Montreal. So we will play game 6, as we should play. Montreal has got Borsley and Rogie Vachon in the nets. Boston, Gary Cheevers, Eddie Johnson, Andrew Gill. It's Cheevers and Worsley who will be in net for those two teams. The 68 Bruins have Phil Esposito, the big trade from Chicago, Johnny Busick, Pye McKenzie, Ken Hodge Sr., that's his son, Ken Hodge Jr., did play for Bruins. Derek Sanderson, Eddie Shack, Fred Stanfield, Tommy Williams, the American, Ed Westfall, Bobby Orr, Glenn Saver, yeah, that Glenn Saver, Ted Green, Skip Craig, Dallas Smith, Don Ulrey, Gary Doak, Lansbury, Wayne Cashman, John Arbor, Ron Murphy, Barry Gibbs. Montreal has Jean Beliveau, Yvan Cournoyer, Dick Duff, Gilles Tremblay, Jacques Lemaire, Ralph Backstrom, Bobby LaRusso, Johnny Ferguson, Claude Provost, Henri Richard, Mickey Redmond, Tim Harris, J.C. Tremblay, Jacques Leperriere, Terry Harper, Danny Grant, before he went to Minnesota, Serge Savard, Claude LaRose, Carol Vadnais, Brian Watson, and Gary Monahan. Here we go, game 1. First period, quickly out of the gate, Habs, Lemaire, no. 4 minutes later, Habs have a chance, Dickie Duff, no. 4 minutes after that, Boston delivers a hit. Both teams just trying to get something. Boston trying to take care of Montreal before going home. Habs with a chance, Beliveau gets hit hard. Not easy when you're 6'4", like Beliveau was. And no score through 1 period. Boston trying to take care of things against Montreal and not have to go home for a game 7. Late in second period, later than normal, Montreal, Beliveau, fuck, no. There's another chance, score! Yvan Cournoyer, his 7th from Russo and Provo. And Montreal leads 1-0. 5 minutes later. For another chance, Dickie Duff, no. Aggression, Boston will be too aggressive. Don Ulrey, 2 minutes in the box. Montreal chance, beep beep, now. Chance, score! Beep beep, Yvan Cournoyer from Ted Harris and Serge Savard. It's 2-0 Montreal. Through 40. 3 minutes later. Pasquier! Gentleman, Jean Beliveau, his 4th. Serge Savard with another assist. 3-0 Montreal. Looks like we got a game 7. Six minutes later. Boston will get penalized. It's Pye McKenzie. Montreal, penalty on Ted Harris. 4-on-4. Nicely done. Chance for Boston. Sanderson? No. This game is practically over. It is over. And Gump Worthley with a giant shutout as Montreal beats Boston 3-0. Cournoyer with 2 goals. Jean Beliveau with 1. And Boston's looking very damper. They'll have to go home for game 7. Unbelievable. So we are going to play game 7. Cheevers versus Worsley, the way it should be in this matchup. First few minutes. Boston Steele, Bobby Orr, number 4. Well, that's the score for the playoffs. From Tommy Williams and Fred Stanfield, and Boston looking good, 1-0. Then much later, another chance, Hodge scores! Ken Hodge Sr. from Shack and Orr, 2-0 Boston. 3 minutes later. Montreal, boo! Ralph Backstrom, the man that Montreal traded to Los Angeles to make sure they get the 71 draft. They won it. From Beliveau and Provo. 2-1 Boston. 2 minutes later. Bruins a chance. Tommy Doe. 6 minutes. Chance for the Bruins. Esposito? No. Montreal trying to counter. They do! Jacques Lemaire, his 7th from Tremblay and Cornouaillet. It's 2-2. 4 minutes later. Chance for Eddie Shack. Help. Couldn't clear the track on that one. 4 goals in that period. The first period. I thought we were in the second period. Guess not. So after 1 period, it's 2-2. 6 minutes into the second. Boston a chance. Westfall. Oh. 3 minutes later. Bobby Russo. No. 4 minutes later. Jean Beliveau. No. And then much later. The teams with a hit. So a quiet second period from these two teams. We saw 4 goals in the first, none in the second. Next up, 3 minutes later. Funk. Boston will go to the box for 2. It's Glenn Saver. Hopefully he doesn't become the GOAT. Cornouaillet looking for a goal, no. Power play chance for Backstrom, no. So Boston avoids that trouble. Much later. Boston gets the through the track. Here comes Shack. Scoring that goal. He's 13th from Westfall and Tommy Williams. Eddie Shack. Eddie Shack. Eddie Shack. 3 minutes later. Finally on Boston, it's Dallas Smith going to the box for 2. Will Montreal tie? John Blay? No. And Cornouaillet tried and he fails. So it looks like we got that going. Empty nets. And that's not going to do it. And somehow, in some way, the Boston Bruins proved that going through hell is just as important as going through heaven. But Boston, who had to come back from 3-0 down against the Red Wings. People forget about that. To get to the second round in the first place, took care of Toronto, took care of Minnesota, and they take care of Montreal in Game 7. Unbelievable. Boston, how the heck did they do that? Yeah, Worsley cannot believe it. As Boston wins on home ice 3-2. I think every game was won by the home team, right? I think so. So anyway, Orr, Hodge, and Shack were the goal scorers for Boston. Backstrom and Lemaire for Montreal. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, all the games were won by the home team. Yeah, but Boston had to go through the preliminary round. Look at that. They lost 5-4, 4-3, and 5-0. It looked like Detroit was going to sweep them. But somehow they won 7-4 in Detroit. They won 3-2 on home turf. Then went to Detroit and won 7-4. Crushed Detroit 6-2 on home turf. And then won 4-1. So they basically played 3 straight games in which they didn't concede. Montreal had to go through the wild card. Well, Montreal had to bye. With the 2 sweeps, it looked like Montreal was going to sweep past Boston. But somehow Boston did not falter. Well, they didn't trail in any. I don't think they trailed in the series after that. I know Toronto tied the series at 1 with them. Oh no, they were down 2-1 to Minnesota, but won 2 games in overtime to help them. All right. Well, anyway, Boston, Cheevers 10-5, Johnston 4-2, Andre Gill, pair wins and pair losses. So yeah, they went through a 7-5-6-7 thing. 25 games. Esposito 33 points. Fred Stanfield second with 25, unbelievable. Buzik 24. Bobby Orr only had 16 points. He was behind Tommy Williams even. Goals, Buzik with 16. Eddie Shack with 13. Espo with 11. Boy, that Espo trade. Chicago must be pissed off with that move. Ed Westfall, Dallas Smith, and Gary Doak. We're going to win goal, but it doesn't matter. So, yeah, Boston did it. They send the Habs packing and are the top seed. Well, in that season, we don't know what's going to happen, but stay tuned. It'll be fun. Anyway, I'm Jeff. I'm going to do.